What happens when a nation known for its multiculturalism suddenly shifts its immigration policies? How do millions of people prepare for the possibility of leaving the place they've come to call home? And what does this mean for Australia's identity on the global stage? In 2025, Australia stands at a crossroads. The new immigration rules have been implemented that could dramatically reshape the country's demographic landscape and force millions of foreign residents to reconsider their future in the land down under. Today, we journey across this vast continent to understand these changes, hear from those affected, and explore what Australia might look like in the aftermath of this significant policy shift. Part 1. Understanding Australia. Australia, a continent of contradictions. The sixth largest country in the world, yet home to just 26 million people. A land where ancient Aboriginal cultures dating back over 65,000 years exist alongside one of the most modern and diverse societies on Earth. Before we delve into the immigration changes reshaping this nation, we must first understand Australia itself. The Commonwealth of Australia comprises 6 states and several territories spanning 7.7 million square kilometers. Despite its vast size, most Australians live along the eastern and southeastern coasts, clustering in urban centres like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth. These cities have become melting pots of culture, with nearly 30% of Australia's population born overseas prior to these new immigration changes. Australia's economy has long been a point of pride, boasting almost 3 decades of uninterrupted growth before the pandemic. This economic success story has been built on abundant natural resources, a robust service sector, and, crucially, immigration. International students alone contributed approximately $40 billion annually to the Australian economy, while skilled migrants filled critical workforce gaps in healthcare, technology, and construction. The Australian way of life, characterized by outdoor living, beach culture, and the concept of fair go for all, has attracted people from around the world seeking opportunity and quality of life. From the tropical rainforests of Queensland to the rugged Tasmanian wilderness, from the cosmopolitan laneways of Melbourne to the red deserts of the outback, Australia's diverse landscapes have provided a backdrop for countless immigrant success stories. But beneath this narrative of multicultural success, tensions have simmered. Housing affordability in major cities has reached crisis levels. Infrastructure has struggled to keep pace with population growth. And debates about Australia's optimal population size and composition have intensified across political divides. Part 2. The 10 new immigration rules. In early 2025, Australia implemented 10 sweeping changes to its immigration framework. These rules, collectively representing the most significant overhaul of the country's immigration system in decades, aim to address these growing concerns while radically reshaping who can stay in Australia and under what conditions. The first rule introduces a dramatically reduced annual immigration cap, slashing permanent migration intake by 50% compared to pre-pandemic levels. This alone means hundreds of thousands fewer residents will be able to remain permanently each year. The second change implements a new points-based system that heavily favors highly skilled workers in specific sectors deemed critical to Australia's economy, particularly advanced manufacturing, green energy, and healthcare. Many current residents whose occupations fall outside these priority areas now find themselves unable to qualify for permanent residency. Third, a regional requirement mandates that new visa holders must live and work in designated regional areas for at least 5 years before becoming eligible for permanent residency. With most immigrants traditionally settling in Sydney and Melbourne, this change aims to redistribute population growth, but poses significant challenges for those unwilling or unable to relocate to rural areas. The fourth rule introduces stringent English language requirements across all visa categories, including for partners and family members of primary applicants. Many long-term residents who have built lives in Australia while speaking their native languages at home now face tests they may struggle to pass. Fifth, the government has instituted a social integration assessment that evaluates applicants' participation in local communities, knowledge of Australian values, and cultural adaptation. Critics argue this subjective measure could lead to discrimination against certain cultural groups. The sixth rule dramatically increases the minimum income requirements for sponsor families, effectively pricing many working-class immigrants out of family reunion options. Thousands of families now face potential long-term or permanent separation. Seventh, student visas have been completely restructured, with post-study work rights severely curtailed, except for graduates in specified fields. The education pathway that many use to transition to permanent residency has narrowed significantly. The eighth rule introduces a national interest test that gives immigration officials broader discretion to reject applications deemed not to serve Australia's economic or social priorities, creating uncertainty even for those who meet all other criteria. Ninth, employer-sponsored visas now require businesses to pay substantially higher fees and demonstrate extensive efforts to hire Australians first, making companies more reluctant to sponsor foreign workers regardless of their qualifications or existing roles. And finally, the 10th rule implements a comprehensive review of all existing temporary residents, with many facing the prospect of non-renewal as their visas expire under the new framework. Part 3. Human Stories. In Sydney's western suburbs, we meet Arun Patel, an IT specialist who arrived from India 8 years ago. Despite building a successful career and buying a home, his path to permanent residency has been thrown into question by the new priority occupation list. I've paid taxes, contributed to the community, made friends here, he says, standing in his backyard where his children play. Now I'm told my skills aren't needed anymore. How do I explain to my kids that we might have to leave the only home they remember? In Melbourne, we visit a university campus where international student enrollment has plummeted. Zhang Wei, a Chinese engineering student, explains his dilemma. I came here with a plan: study, gain work experience, eventually settle. Now the rules have changed mid-game. My friends back home are asking if they should avoid Australia altogether. At a farm in regional Victoria, we meet Maria Rodriguez, who moved from the Philippines to work in agriculture. The new regional requirement benefits her situation, but she worries about the cultural isolation and limited opportunities for her children. Yes, I can stay, but at what cost to my family's future? She asks as she harvests vegetables in the early morning light. In Perth, we speak with Ahmed Hassan, a Syrian refugee who has rebuilt his life over the past 7 years. The new integration assessment has him worried. How do they measure integration? He wonders. I speak English, I work, I follow Australian laws, but I still maintain my cultural identity. Is that now going to count against me? As we travel across the country, we witness communities mobilizing. In Brisbane, a coalition of business leaders warns about economic impacts. On university campuses, students stage demonstrations. In ethnic enclaves from Box Hill to Cabramatta, community leaders organize information sessions to help residents understand their options. Part 4. The broader context. Australia's policy shift doesn't exist in isolation. Across the developed world, immigration policies have tightened as nations grapple with economic uncertainties, housing pressures, and changing political landscapes. From Europe to North America, similar debates about migration levels and national identity have intensified. Yet Australia's case is particularly striking, given its historical identity as a nation of immigrants, apart from Indigenous Australians, and its previously robust multicultural framework. Since the abandonment of the White Australia policy in the 1970s, successive governments had built a reputation for relatively progressive immigration policies compared to many other developed nations. Dr. Eleanor Fitzgerald, a political scientist at the Australian National University, provides context. What we're seeing is a pendulum swing. Australia has periodically adjusted its immigration intake throughout history, but the current changes represent one of the most significant restrictions in modern times. The question is whether this is a temporary adjustment or a fundamental rethinking of Australia's relationship with immigration. Part 5. Economic and social implications. The economic consequences of these changes are already being felt across multiple sectors. Universities that relied heavily on international student revenue announced staff cuts and program closures. Construction projects slow as both labor supply and housing demand projections shift. Restaurants and retail businesses in areas with high immigrant populations report declining sales. The math is simple, explains economist Dr. Michael Chang. Less population growth means less consumption, less housing construction, and potentially less innovation. While there may be short-term relief on infrastructure and housing prices, the long-term growth trajectory is almost certainly lower. But supporters of the new policies point to different metrics. In some cities, rental vacancy rates have increased slightly, offering modest relief in the housing crisis. And some regional towns are experiencing newfound growth as immigrants relocate to maintain their visa status. Beyond economics, the social fabric shows signs of strain. Reports of increased discrimination have emerged, with some long-term residents describing a new sense of unwelcome despite their legal status. Community organizations report rising anxiety and mental health concerns among immigrant communities facing uncertainty. Part 6. The Future Australia. As our journey across Australia concludes, we're left to contemplate what these changes mean for the future of this unique nation. Will Australia's multicultural character fundamentally change? Will the economic impacts force a policy reversal? And what happens to the millions who may need to leave and to the communities they leave behind? In Canberra, policy experts suggest that some aspects of the new framework may be adjusted as real-world impacts become clearer. Immigration policy is always iterative, notes former Immigration Department official Sarah Johnston. The pendulum rarely stays at one extreme for long. For individuals caught in this transition, difficult choices lie ahead. Some are accelerating plans to obtain citizenship. Others are exploring options in alternative destinations like Canada or returning to increasingly prosperous home countries. Many remain in limbo, waiting to see how strictly the new rules will be implemented and whether exceptions might emerge. What is clear is that Australia in 2026 will look different than it does today. Whether that difference represents a temporary adjustment or a permanent shift in the nation's demographic trajectory remains to be seen. But for a country built on waves of immigration, from the British colonization to the post-war European migration to the Asian and Middle Eastern arrivals of recent decades, this moment represents a crossroads of historical significance. As the sun sets over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, we're reminded that Australia's story has always been one of adaptation and reinvention. The latest chapter in its immigration story is still being written, with millions of personal stories hanging in the balance. Closing narration. 10 new rules. Millions of lives affected. One nation at a crossroads. This is Australia in 2025. A country redefining who can call it home, and in the process, perhaps redefining itself.